Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Konyndyk. I'm the president of Refugees International, and we are really pleased that you have all joined us here today. We've seen a ton of interest in this webinar, I think very understandably, given the news that we've seen coming out over the course of the week about the enormous challenges now facing refugees and displaced people who have obtained or who are seeking protection in the United States. It has been a devastating week for displaced people in this country. Just an absolute whirlwind of bad news. I'm sure all of you have struggled to keep up with it. Even for us who do this day in and day out, it's been a struggle to keep up with each new executive order and each new story and each new development that we see coming out. So what we're going to do today is do our best to try and walk through that with all of you, answer your questions, provide for you our best understanding of where things stand and where things are going. Um, some of the really damaging and counterproductive and harmful developments that we've seen this week. Perhaps top of the list is an indefinite refugee ban, a complete halt to refugees arriving in the United States through the longstanding and bipartisan refugee admissions program. We've also seen an immediate halt to the humanitarian parole programs that had been used to enable Afghans, Ukrainians, Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and others to settle in this country and to seek protection in this country. And we've seen at the border a complete halt in any access to asylum in the United States. Um, there are a lot more pieces of what's gone wrong on migration policy this week. And rather than kind of go through the full litany of those, I want to just talk about some of the human impacts that we're seeing. What effects is that having on refugees and people who need protection in this country? We have heard from our partners stories of Afghan families whose parents had come here seeking protection after the fall of Kabul, whose lives were under immediate threat, who had to flee without their children, whose children were due to finally fly to the United States to be reunited with their parents in the coming weeks. All of those flights have now been canceled, and those children are now stranded, some in refugee camps, some just kind of living informally and unable to be reunited with their parents. You can imagine how absolutely devastating that must be for those families. We heard an example of a story, of a family who had been resettled, refugees resettled from a host country in Africa. They were South Sudanese refugees. One of the daughters in their family had an issue with the fingerprint identification, so she was not allowed to board the plane with the rest of her family. Her family came here in early January. They had a flight booked for her to get her paperwork corrected and be reunited in the next couple of weeks. Her flight is now canceled, and she is stranded indefinitely in a refugee settlement with no family around, with no protection, while the rest of her family is here absolutely heartsick. Meanwhile, down in Mexico, people who had appointments to have asylum screenings in the United States, who had often traversed very long distances, very arduous trips seeking the safety of the United States and playing by the rules to seek asylum in the right and legal way, that had been laid out by the US government, had often, in many cases, waited for months in Mexico for those appointments because they wanted to play by the rules that they'd been given, completely had the rug pulled out from under them and are now stranded indefinitely in Mexico at the mercy of the cartels. Um, we know what this is fundamentally about. This is not fundamentally about controlling illegal migration. This is targeting legal migration. Everything I just talked about is undermining legal migration. Refugee resettlement is legal migration. Parole is legal migration. Seeking asylum at the border is legal migration. There was a very instructive quote that Trump's top immigration official, Stephen Miller, gave during the campaign season when he talked about, we don't need people coming here from failed states. What this is about is not how people are coming here, it is about where people are coming from. And it is deeply un-American to operate that way. It recalls some of the worst moments of our national history of immigration policies that excluded people not based on their protection needs, not based on the needs of our economy in this country, but really just based on bigotry about where they come from. That is fundamentally un-American, and like you, we are ready to fight it. It will damage our cohesion and our prosperity as a country, but we're not despairing over this. We are energized and we are ready to push back. We are ready to work with many of you to fight this through the legal system, but as importantly as that, to show the government that Americans support being a welcoming country, that Americans want to be a welcoming country. And we know that our polling has shown that, other polling has shown that. Maybe I'll end on this note, and this is something that really gives us a lot of hope, at least in the long run, if not the short run. We have done multiple rounds of polling in recent years, including one at the height of the campaign in September of last year, looking at voter attitudes towards welcoming refugees in this country. And in every single poll, we have found strong majority support for continuing to welcome refugees. And what we found is that when someone personally knows a refugee, their pro-refugee views go up 20 points. So that also tells us that part of what we need to do over the next 4 years is connect refugees to their communities and connect people to refugees and their stories and their experiences. Because when we can see each other as humans, we will support each other as humans, and there will be much more support for humane and welcoming policies in this country. And so we are confident that in the long run, we will turn some of these things around, but it is going to be a hard slog in the next couple of years. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mohammed Naeem. Mohammed recently joined Refugees International from the American Immigration Council and has been working in this field for more than a decade on movement building and global advocacy around refugee and migration issues, and has his own personal story of that as well. So, Mohammed, over to you to run the session for us today.
All right, Jeremy, thank you. Thank you so much for that very sobering, but also sort of like determined message to all of our colleagues and friends across this country and really across the world. Thank you for joining us today. These are difficult days for our community, as Jeremy had noted, also for our country, and really most critically for all those living with deep uncertainty for themselves and their families. As Refugees International, we will continue to stand, as we've always done since 1979, stand with all those who seek safety and refuge, and continue to speak freely and with principle in the days and in the weeks and the years ahead. Before we dive in, I would like to share just a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll hear from several of my esteemed colleagues across our portfolios of work, with both the domestic and international perspective. We'll follow that by an audience Q&A, and then we'll close out the webinar with some concluding remarks from Jeremy, our president, who you just heard from. I encourage you to submit your questions whenever you'd like, and we'll keep a log. Either we'll answer it through the chat if we can, but we'll also try to get to them during the audience Q&A portion. Once again, I'm really grateful for each of you joining, so let's begin and dive right in. First, I would like to introduce my colleague, Yael Schacher, who is Refugees International's Director for the Americas and Europe, and is our in-house expert on immigration, on refugee policy, and the U.S. asylum system. As you can imagine, she's been extraordinarily busy this week, and so I'm so grateful that we have Dr. Yael Schacher on our team. And so let's begin the discussion with Yael. So Jeremy had noted at the very top the very real and damaging effect of President Trump's actions on our asylum and resettlement system. Dr. Schacher, I'd love for you to expand on that. What are the near-term domestic consequences of the president's actions, and what effect will this have, in your opinion, on our relationship with allies across the region, across the Americas, and especially upon those who hope to seek refuge in the United States?
Thanks so much. And I just want to say, like Jeremy said, this has been quite a week, and I'm not going to be able to cover every order and every policy that's come down. I'll focus on, what Mohammed has asked me about. But if you have questions about others, feel free to put them in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them at the end of the webinar. Um, within immigrant communities, as Mohammed was indicating, there's just a lot of fear right now. And that's because there are several executive orders and policy memos that seek to really criminalize immigrants or even to illegalize people with legal presence in the United States, as Jeremy was mentioning. There are examples of this. I'll just point to two. One of the executive orders invokes a registry provision that uses a very outdated statute to require all non-citizens to register and present their fingerprints to the US government under, like, again, a very rarely used provision of US law, and then declaring anybody who doesn't register subject to criminal penalties. Another EO called for the termination of the parole programs, as Jeremy mentioned at the top, like the Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua program. A memo from yesterday called for DHS to start targeting parolees in the United States for expedited removal procedures. Now, it's important to understand that there is time to challenge many of these policies. There's no system set up to register people right now, and that would require a lot of support from local communities to do. The parole programs are under review, and there's no clear plan for how to arrest or detain or deport people from those countries, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, to which it is very difficult for US to deport people. There are ways that CHMV parolees can protect themselves. We already put out a sort of explainer before the Trump administration advising people to apply for asylum, to apply for TPS, and those do add protections to people who have parole status. I'm going to ask my colleagues to put some resources in the chat that sort of indicate how, kind of know your rights resources that indicate how immigrants can really protect themselves from some of the egregious policies that have been laid out this week. And Refugees International will be putting out more information about why programs like parole, for example, are so important to preserve, and working with members of Congress and with litigators to protect those programs and to protect the people who are here with that status. We are doing the same with the ban on refugee resettlement that was mentioned just before, and that's gone into place, and that has already stranded people in danger and separated families, as Jeremy mentioned, and that Kate will talk more about. But that is also a policy and a suspension that we are going to urge people to contact members of Congress to make sure that make the case that this is an important policy that should be preserved and we shouldn't let this suspension happen. Now, asylum at the border has been under threat for years. This administration, as Jeremy mentioned, suspends it completely in violation of our law and obligations, but also including people waiting for CBP-1 appointments, right? And I just want to say, the CBP-1 policy was coordinated with the Mexican government up until Sunday. Buses were coming from southern Mexico, arriving at the northern part of the border to Mexican buses that were under the Mexican Immigration Authority ran those buses to bring people with CBP-1 appointments north for their appointments. And so the Mexican government sort of didn't know that this was going to happen. And I think the implications for, US policy in the region is that, as Jeremy said, the rug was ripped out from under the people waiting for these appointments. Why would anybody ever get in line again and trust the United States when it asks people, when it creates policies? Why would other countries trust the United States to work with the United States to manage migration, which is a regional problem in the Americas? It's not a problem that only the United States is facing. There's forced displacement all over the Americas. Colombia is hosting millions of Venezuelans. We need to work together on this crisis. And the idea that the United States is not really a good faith partner because its policies are constantly changing within administrations from one administration to the next is really, really putting us at a disadvantage. It's also disturbing that the State Department has shifted its priorities to focus almost exclusively on keeping people away from the US border, and that the Department of Defense has blocked out all of its social media except for its work at the border this week. And that is not really what those agencies are supposed to do in the world. Refugees has, stood strong in our opposition to responsibility shifting policies like safe third country agreements that Senator Rubio looks to be negotiating when he travels in the region next week. And we will stand firm against those policies again. The use of the US military at the border should be the kind of policy that will rally the American people in opposition to it, to say enough is enough, and may be a real opportunity for us to really be putting forward instead a different vision, an affirmative vision for asylum at the border that allows for processing at the border, for a fair adjudication process, allowing asylum seekers to work, creating a sensible distribution and coordination system supporting communities of welcome in the United States. So even as RI continues to play defense, to litigate, to support immigrants in this country, we will continue to sort of build that affirmative case for asylum moving forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that very thorough overview. And I know that you, Yael, will continue to hear from you as these policies are fully rolled out in the weeks and months ahead. This was a full-blown attack in every which way possible on those who seek refuge and protection here in the United States. And I know Refugees International will continue to lead and spearhead work in the weeks and sort of months ahead. I'd like to now bring in my colleague Kate Brick. So Kate is the executive director of the Refugee Advocacy Lab, as well as a senior advisor to the strategic outreach team at Refugees International. The Refugee Advocacy Lab is a multi-stakeholder initiative to grow and fortify the movement for U.S. leadership on the inclusion and the protection of people who have been forcibly displaced. And the lab works across three key pillars of work: strategic communications, championing inclusive policies, and building capacity for the field all across this country. Kate, I'd love to build on a bit of what Yael just shared on the domestic front. You have deep experience working with state and local officials across your career. In your perspective, what are some of the most pressing implications these executive orders have for local communities? And really, what kind of advocacy might be needed to push back against these egregious and nativist policies?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mohammed. As with all domestic immigration policy, the impacts of the O's that and the new policies that Yael just went through, and specifically ones that are focused on the interior of the country, are going to be felt most directly at the state and local level, and in particular, the halt of the refugee resettlement program, and also a new enforcement mandate go into a little bit more detail about. But I think it's worth noting that targeting localities and explicitly using localities as a justification for some of these policies has been a central theme in the Trump administration's narrative for why immigration policy and protection policy specifically should be rolled back. So if we look first at the halt of the refugee resettlement program, in the language of the executive order, it specifically references the increase of migrants to local communities as a reason why the resettlement program should be rolled back, falsely implying that American communities don't have resources to continue to welcome refugees through a program that has received bipartisan public support since it was established more than 45 years ago. And the reality is that refugee resettlement and, frankly, migration more broadly has been a boon for communities across the country, especially in cities and towns in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, where resettlement and migration have been a key driver of economic revitalization and growth. And so ending this program is going to harm, not help, local communities nationwide. Last fall, right before President Biden was putting forth his presidential determination on refugee resettlement, nearly 500 state and local elected officials from all 50 states signed a letter to President Biden affirming their support for refugee resettlement and calling on him to invest further in strengthening the program, emphasizing that people seeking safety help make our communities more vibrant and strong. And this is included through starting new businesses, filling gaps in the workforce in key industries like healthcare, hospitality, manufacturing, and bringing so much cultural vitality and diversity to our communities. And this reflects broader American public sentiment, as well as Jeremy shared earlier. A strong majority of likely voters that we polled before the end of the year believe the United States should continue to have a resettlement program. So I say this because it's important to know that in the executive order, it calls for an evaluation of the resettlement program over the next 90 days and then every 90 days thereafter, which will include a specific review of the role of states and localities in having greater involvement in decisions that are made about refugee resettlement. So given this, the support of state and local officials for this program will be really, really critical to amplify and to build upon in the coming weeks. The other piece of the policy that, or many pieces of this policy, but one that's directly targeting localities, is a new mandate that is forcing states and localities who currently have policies to not use local law enforcement towards federal immigration enforcement, which is also known as sanctuary policies, to cooperate with federal immigration agents, otherwise known as ICE, or else lose federal funding and even be at risk of prosecution. And this is a direct threat to cities across the country who have welcoming policies for immigrants and refugees, and it's meant to frighten them into compliance. For localities, this becomes both a public safety issue and also a resource issue. When people are afraid to go to the police and report crimes, everybody is less safe. And now with this new rule that ICE can enter schools and places of worship and hospitals, this is going to create an environment of fear that's going to keep people from going to work. It's going to keep kids, including US citizen children, from going to school, and ultimately break apart the social and economic fabric in cities, as millions of people are now going to be eligible for detention and deportation with some of these new guidelines Yael just described, specifically as it relates to people who are here on parole. It also puts tremendous strain on state and local budgets to use already very limited resources for law enforcement towards these federal priorities. And sheriffs and law enforcement across the country have already spoken out against these types of policies and how they're not in the best interest of their communities. In cities like Chicago and the Twin Cities and others, mayors have already come out strongly that they're going to stay true to their existing policies that don't allow local law enforcement to collaborate with ICE, and we really hope that others follow suit. So, Mohammed, answering your question about the advocacy that's needed, it is imperative that state and local elected officials, and especially the ones who are already taking a stand, that they hear from us, their constituents, that we support and implore them to hold their ground and to send a message to Washington that these policies are not in the best interests of their communities. We need them to be strong advocates and allies. And in order for them to do that in this political climate, they need to know that this is the mandate of the people who elected them and not the disinformation that's being spread by the Trump administration. So before the inauguration, the lab worked with several partners to launch the United in Welcome campaign, which is an opportunity for people to write their local, state, and federal elected officials, calling on them to continue to champion welcoming policies. We really, really encourage all of you to take 2 minutes and take action with your own elected leaders if you haven't yet. And please share the word with your communities. We want this message to be shared across the country, and in particular in red and purple states where there will be a lot more challenges, especially from a state policy environment. The last thing I want to share just is how important it is going to be to elevate the voices and the stories of people who have been directly impacted by these policies. So we're working with members of the Refugee Storytellers Collective to ensure that the direct human impact of these new policies are known and visible in the public dialogue. And we encourage folks who know people and work with people for whom this is directly impacting to encourage them and give them a platform to share their experience as well. So I'll pause there, happy to answer questions later, but back to you, Mohammed.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kate, for that perspective. I mean, it is clear to me, and certainly clear based on your work over the last, over the last decade, how critical state and local officials have always been, really, and will continue to be so critical to advocacy efforts. And that last piece, specifically around highlighting and sort of centralizing the perspectives of those with lived forced displacement experience, is fundamental. And this is a wonderful segue, in fact, to now bring in our colleague Lucky Karim, who not only has a technical understanding of the resettlement system, but in fact has lived through it just recently. It's like Lucky is part of our Refugee Fellows program here at Refugees International. She's a human rights activist from Myanmar, having spent 6 years in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. And during that time, she worked with a number of international humanitarian organizations to serve her community in Cox's Bazar. She and her family were resettled to the United States just 2 years ago, like I just briefly mentioned. And that's where Lucky and Lucky has been able to continue her vital work in education in safety. So Lucky, welcome. As somebody who has endured through the experience of forced displacement, what does the resettlement program mean to you personally? And what message might you want to send to refugees all across the world, some of whom are tuned in right now, who someday hope to realize lasting safety and refuge? Yeah, let me pass it over to you, Lucky.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks to Refugees International for hosting this very important discussion timely. As Mohammed has mentioned, I am as someone who has spent 6 years, over 6 years in the world largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. And it's been over 2 years since I arrived in the US, and now I'm based in Chicago. I just quickly can give an example. When I first landed in the US, I feel like I was the firstborn to this world. Comparing to my past 15, 14 years in the refugee camp in the isolated area back in my country where I grew up and I was born, everything is completely different, including the life, the human rights, and the cultures and everything. And I realized soon after I arrived in the US, was we're just in the same world, it's just a different country where I was born. So I think it's almost the same for every displaced refugees around the world who have been waiting for so long to finally find sustainable solutions to be able to return to back to their homes, which sadly doesn't happen overnight, over a year. It takes a long efforts of our work. And I think from my personal experience, resettlement program doesn't just bring people into the United States and then give us some documentation, legal status, but actually it gives us hope to future. And of course, for us, safety and security, and to make us actually feel as a human being that we belong to this country and to this world, and which is why I finally call America home. I think the most important part of this program is it's just few individuals and family who are getting resettled to these countries, but there are thousands and tens of thousands and millions of people displaced still left behind in the refugee camp or the border who are needing our support, and we can't do our work while we still at risk. So I think bringing people to these countries also allow us to keep working on our rights, and for the people who we love and we belong to, and for those who are still in the refugee camp. For me, I'm one of the great example, and I had to be back off camera and off everything, even though I was one of the survivors back in 2017 from Myanmar to Bangladesh. I could only speak up for myself and for the people I love and I belong to soon after I arrived in the US. So that's just the same for every refugees and displaced people around the world. And it's so important for us to encourage refugees and of course for us to keep working on our main ultimate goal, which is for us to go back to our country one day, which again, doesn't come tomorrow or soon. And I think the most important part of the issue is also bringing these people through the resettlement program is just so important to one of the countries like US who cares about the human rights. And of course, that's just not obviously gives us some documentation to legally and finally call home. But again, it is the place where we can have an open discussions about every human rights violations we have gone through. So I would again be very much grateful and thankful to the US and the administration and everyone who made it happen. And thankfully, my family and I were the first BH program to directly resettle from Cox's Bazar to the US. And later on, there were some individuals and families, a number of them who have come across. So this is a sad news again for us. But we're so thankful to the country and everyone who made it happen. So I really hope this continue for not just Rohingya refugees in Myanmar, but actually for every one of us around the world who have been through the similar situations and almost with the same purpose and the reasons. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lucky, for your courage, really for your determination, for having done the work during your time as you were forcibly displaced, but also here in the US. We as a country are so grateful that you're here and you're contributing in all the ways that you can. I myself have also benefited from the resettlement program and my family, and I live in a refugee community in Queens, New York. And so these issues are so deeply personal, and there's nothing more poignant, in fact, than sort of your quote around the fact that it feels like you're reborn when you're finally able to secure refuge, and that the United States is stepping away from being able to offer that really speaks volumes about our country. Um, I'd love to bring in my colleague Hardin Lang. Hardin, as many of you know, is Refugee International's Vice President of Programs. He's a veteran of peacekeeping and humanitarian field missions for a number of decades. And Hardin leads all aspects of our programmatic work. Hardin, one of the EOs was specifically related to foreign development assistance. Would love for you to sort of untangle for the audience what potential consequences of freezing that assistance might have on vulnerable populations, and how will this affect our standing amongst our allies and our adversaries?
Yeah, Mohammed, thanks very much. We've heard a lot so far about what's been happening at the border, at the state level. And so along with Lucky, I'm really going to sort of pivot and talk a bit about Trump's executive order on freezing foreign aid, or the impacts outside of the United States of some of these actions. I'll try to address four things. One, I'm going to outline the substance of the executive order. Two, I'm going to try to review its practical human implications. Three, issue spot things to keep an eye on. And then four, speculate a bit about the wider strategic implications of the order. The bottom line up front is that the order freezes hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly more, going to support communities across continents. And here you need to think of tents for people in Gaza, or like food and support for those facing famine in Sudan, or school materials for Rohingya children in camps in Bangladesh, or HIV meds for communities across Africa. The order halts the disbursement of foreign aid pending a 90-day review. The stated objective of this review is to ensure efficiency and consistency with the United States foreign policy. This includes funding for foreign countries, NGOs, and international organizations. Department and agencies are required to conduct a review of their foreign assistance programs, and the Secretary of State will decide within 90 days whether to continue dispensing, modify, or cease foreign aid. So, what are the immediate practical human impacts of the pauses? First, all this is leading to massive uncertainty for aid groups about whether they will have resources to respond to ongoing mega crises, given that all new grant making is paused, and they're even suspending payments or obligation tranches for ongoing programs. Second, the suspension of USAID travel means that US government staff can no longer conduct routine oversight support activities on the programs they are funding. And third, this is a fundamentally clumsy, blunt instrument approach to foreign aid review, halting everything regardless of its importance or merit. The impact will be felt acutely in mouths not fed and wounds not treated in crisis zones. We're beginning to learn more even right now as sort of guidance notes are emerging about this order, and there may be opportunities to use waivers and others to exempt certain kind of aid. And so let's sort of dive in a bit to issues to keep an eye on. First, one real thing is to focus on the programmatic scope. The impact of the pause will depend on whether the Trump administration uses it to filter out a relatively small number of programs that it disagrees with at a culture war level, or to undertake comprehensive review of the full foreign assistance portfolio. If it's focused on, say, culture war targets, and here think family planning or climate change, then the impact could be limited. However, our initial indications are that we should expect a comprehensive review across the full gamut of U.S. assistance programs. The reviews look set to encompass every level of programming, and this will likely take longer than 3 months and have far-reaching consequences. So it's time for everyone to sort of buckle up. Another key issue is going to be agency coverage. It's unclear whether the executive order applies to just the State Department and USID, or if it covers other US agencies like the Millennium Challenge Corporation or the US International Development Finance Corporation. These agencies have enjoyed a lot of autonomy in the past, and it's unclear how their programs are going to be treated. Another key issue to watch in the coming weeks is program vulnerability to temporary disruptions. There are certain types of assistance that are highly vulnerable to temporary disruptions, like humanitarian aid, but also public health. So we're getting some indications that, for example, emergency food assistance may be waived and that will be allowed to proceed. But then we also have to look at issues like public health, where the US is one of the main funders of malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and vaccine programs worldwide. Without that funding, countries can no longer provide life-saving medical interventions to those who are relying on them for survival. Now we get to the question of exemptions, which were raised. The executive order allows the Secretary of State to waive the review process for specific programs. We understand that departments and agencies have received some internal guidance to limit requests for humanitarian waivers beyond humanitarian assistance. We also understand that foreign aid for Israel, Egypt, and a couple of other countries will continue, and that again, emergency food assistance is going to be allowed to continue. But that still leaves a tremendous amount of uncertainty and latitude for what the Secretary of State could do. And literally now, the Secretary of State, hundreds of thousands, if not more, lives are vested in his hands as he's making decisions about what to clear. It's really critical to see how fast and how big that he's willing to go in terms of the waiver authority. And then there are two sort of wider implications of this, I think, getting to your question, Mohammed, that really merit further review. One is that there's a tremendous amount of policy dissonance between what the Trump administration has done on the one hand in terms of limiting pathways to safety for people in desperate need of refuge. Trump has shut down pathways for people in conflict, humanitarian disaster, who are seeking safety outside their countries. But on the other hand, he's pausing the aid that people need to survive or recover inside the crisis zone. So we've seen what this looks like in Sudan, where millions of people were deprived of both safety and aid. And this is a recipe for an explosion in suffering and instability. As people in crisis zones become more desperate, they will seek refuge elsewhere and by any means necessary. And the result will fuel mass migration and make it more chaotic. And sort of none of this is aligned with American values or American interests. The other thing to really, at a strategic level, that's interesting about this is that all U.S. administrations have sought to leverage foreign assistance to further U.S. interest and foreign policy objectives to a certain extent. You look no farther than the amount of U.S. humanitarian development assistance flowing to Ukraine relative to a crisis like Sudan. Sudan is clearly the worst humanitarian crisis in the world at this stage, but it gets only a fraction of the aid headed to Ukraine, a top foreign policy priority for the Biden administration. But Trump looks poised to remake foreign assistance, much as he's remaking access for legal and illegal migration in the United States, but remaking it into a tool of transactional diplomacy in service of the America First agenda. For example, Trump may seek to trade foreign aid for communities to crack down, to require governments to crack down on migrants or to receive deportees. And so the toll in terms of human suffering and damage to American soft power promises to be profound. And it is a sort of systems change, or moment of inflection in the way in which the United States has sort of thought about humanitarian aid and development aid moving forward. I'll stop there, Mohammed, and turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hardin, for really just crystallizing how this week's actions will shape our global standing around the issues you highlighted. And audience members, if there's a clear takeaway, it's really a systems-wide restructuring of the architecture that has long allowed the United States to take a leadership role in being able to support all those seeking refuge, but really provide timely and necessary humanitarian aid assistance. It's a really wonderful segue here to my colleague Dan Sullivan. Dan is our director for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, has over 20 years of human rights and foreign policy experience between several leading organizations. And over the last few years, Dan has spearheaded our advocacy efforts related to the genocide in Sudan that Hardin had just mentioned being the worst humanitarian crisis on our planet. Dan leads other portfolios and files as well. Dan, given the previous administration's the previous administration's determination of genocide in Sudan and some of the related sanctions on both parties, as well as messaging from the Trump appointees, most critically now Secretary Rubio. How do you foresee advocacy opportunities for addressing the crisis in Sudan under this new administration?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, and I want to emphasize that this is as Hardin mentioned, this is the largest by numbers humanitarian and displacement crisis marked by atrocities in the world. But in comparison to some of the other issues, this may be an issue where there is some positive potential for change coming forward with the Trump administration. I say that with some cautious optimism, but just to kind of explain first of all, to give a background of our Refugees International's work on Sudan since the current crisis started in April of 2023. We've traveled to the borders with Sudan and Chad, in Egypt, in South Sudan, and into the Nuba Mountains in Sudan to talk to people who have been affected by the crisis, and those that are working with them. And that is something we're going to continue to do to try to highlight this issue that I think most people probably on this call are aware of this, but more generally, it has not gotten the attention it deserves. And just looking at the pure numbers and the trajectory of what's going on, and that includes a significant number of people facing famine, and likely more to face famine in the coming months if things don't change. The sort of good news here is that at the end of the Biden administration, there were some significant steps taken, powerful steps. Number one, recognizing what the RSF party is doing as genocide. This adds to a previous atrocity determination that found both sides, the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF, responsible for war crimes. So that's important. What's important is that it was also paired with targeted sanctions, including on the head of the RSF, and so that we hope will provide some momentum into the next administration, where we have gotten some. I would say it's mixed messages, but some positive ones from Marco Rubio, who is now Secretary of State. Mentioning, both saying that this is genocide in Sudan and calling out external actors, including the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, which is something that Refugees International and our partners have really tried to shine a light on. And there are other members of the administration who have indicated that they are dedicated to appointing a special envoy on Sudan, something that some existing legislation requires. But as we know in the past, that doesn't always happen very quickly, and it's also very important that not just that you have a special envoy, but who that is and what their approach is going to be. So that's something that Refugees International, with our partners, will be focusing on. So that's sort of, there's a potential for some positive action. On the other side, we are well aware and keeping a close eye on everything my colleagues mentioned earlier, these executive orders, what effect that's going to have on Sudanese refugees, on the possibility of them finding refuge in the United States, and also support for those countries surrounding Sudan who are hosting so many Sudanese refugees. So there's a mixed bag here, but there is the potential to push in a positive direction. And let me just close out by saying that, giving a concrete example of what you all can do to help in spreading the word and getting attention to Sudan. We worked with partners, and graciously, the actor Don Cheadle narrated a video that is an explainer of what the UAE's role is in Sudan. And want to recognize there are several other countries, lots of external actors. We found the UAE to be particularly egregious in their providing of weapons to the RSF, which, as the United States found, is responsible for genocide. So, as the Trump administration, Congress, others look at the role of the UAE in the world more generally, and the bilateral relationship with the U.S. We want to make sure that it's very clear to the public, and that public pressure goes to the Trump administration, that it is unacceptable for an actor like the UAE to be supplying weapons to a group that is committing genocide. And so I believe my colleagues put that link in the chat. So that is one thing that everyone can take away from this, and encourage you to watch the video, learn about what the role is, and share that. And there will be much more that we will be doing, working with Congress, working with Sudanese-led groups and others in the year ahead. But again, I think this is one path, or one issue where we hope that we can see some positive movement. Thanks.
It's like, thank you so much, Dan, really for helping illustrate, and really for leading this work at our organization, and really placing a focus on a crisis that has not received, and regrettably has not received, the focus that it deserves, both across our government, but really across this country and across this world. From one crisis to another crisis. I'd like to bring in my colleague, Jesse Marks. Jesse is our senior advocate for the Middle East, has spent well over a decade working on humanitarian and refugee crises in the region. He leads RI's work on advocacy on Gaza and Syria, amongst other conflicts in the region. So Jesse, like the Middle East, is going through major sort of crises and reshifting, both across Gaza and Syria, with agreements, with the ceasefire agreement last week, and then sort of what had just occurred over the last month, or the last few months in Syria. Can you walk us through a little bit through what the Trump administration means, or what the administration's policy might mean for Gaza and Syria moving forward, and really for your work?
Yes, thank you, Mohammed. I appreciate it. Yeah, the Trump administration is inheriting a deeply unstable Middle East. We have new major humanitarian displacement crises unfolding as we speak in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. While things may have slowed in the recent weeks, as Hardin mentioned, the administration's first week has already set a negative precedent for what will be a complex and challenging regional landscape, with major impacts as a result of Trump's freeze on humanitarian aid. I mean, this is going to have an immediate impact on the ability for millions of refugees and internally displaced persons across the region to access aid and services, which are traditionally provided through U.S. funding and programs. On Gaza, one major key development was Trump's Middle East envoy pushing Israel to accept a ceasefire and a hostage deal. While this did create a brief reprieve for millions of Palestinians, the future of the ceasefire is still very much so uncertain. Coupled with some of these challenges, the Trump administration is continuing to push to defund UNRWA, which is the organization which provides humanitarian assistance, support, and services for Palestinian refugees. And this effort ultimately would undermine critical support for Palestinians across the region, not just in Israel and Palestine, but also in neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Inside Gaza, since the ceasefire, aid is slowly beginning to make its way in. We've seen more truck numbers go in than we've seen in the last, I think, 24, 48 hours. The numbers have reached 600 trucks going in. People are also returning slowly to find their homes in ruins. This has created some quite troubling imagery, and people are going back to finding very little. We've heard stories of people going back, and in some very gruesome cases, going through rubble to find the remains of their family members who have been missing for months on end. At Refugees International, we're committed to advocating for Palestinians' rights to access humanitarian aid, to rebuild their lives, and to have a voice in the future. This includes protecting UNRWA's role in providing critical aid to Palestinians. It is crucial that Palestinians are included in all of these conversations. RI is incredibly lucky. I am incredibly lucky to be able to work with our refugee fellow, Jamal Abu Nahla, whose work aims to also ensure critical aid is being delivered to Palestinian refugees in Gaza and in Egypt. And I cannot underscore how important it is to have Palestinian voices, and across our work, refugee voices at the table, shaping policies which impact their lives and their futures. Shifting beyond Gaza, also in the region, Syria's had quite a transformative impact. For the first time in 50 years, Syria has a chance to rebuild a nation that truly serves all Syrians. It's crucial in this moment for the Trump administration to take a proactive role in ensuring that Syrians can, in a way, can take a proactive role in Syrian recovery in a way that allows displaced Syrians specifically to return safely, voluntarily, and in dignity. Right now, there are over 6 million Syrian refugees outside of the country, and more than 7 million who are internally displaced, who are in need of urgent, lasting solutions to rebuild their lives. At Refugees International, for nearly a decade, we have been working closely with Syrian-led NGOs on providing humanitarian assistance and support across Syria. But now we have a very powerful and important moment in which we can work toward providing life-saving support and lay the groundwork for rebuilding a Syria, and that people can gradually return to, can rebuild their lives and find a level of peace and comfort after 14 years of conflict. There's so much to be done across the Middle East to provide solutions for millions. I'm excited to get to work with our colleagues, with refugee-led organizations, with our Palestinian partners, with folks in the region who are working toward providing lasting solutions for displaced communities. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're really excited to have the chance to be able to do that with them.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Jesse. And I know we'll hear from you in the weeks and months ahead. We last but not least, so many actions were taken by this administration, and really what you're seeing here is really the full spectrum and gamut of sort of that reshaping of the system, as Hardin called it earlier. And one of the most critical EOs, a critical EO that was passed was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Would love to bring in my colleague Jocelyn Perry. Jocelyn is our senior advocate and program manager of the Climate Displacement Program. She has spent over 15 years working in advocacy, policymaking, and research on climate change and with displaced populations. I know, Jocelyn, you've been monitoring the implications of the administration's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, just among other actions in the climate space. How will this affect displaced populations and your work sort of more broadly?
Thank you so much, Mohammed. And yeah, if all of those crises and immediate and future impacts that we're addressing in the climate and migration space and displacement space and refugee space weren't enough, we're just layering the climate crisis on top of that. And I want to make very clear that we don't think of the climate crisis as something distinct from, but something that deeply affects the lives of all communities, including the displaced communities that we work with around the world. So I want to start by harkening back to some of Hardin's comments on foreign development assistance and our relationship with other countries. So withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, which for those who aren't familiar with it, is our principal international climate agreement that 194 other countries other than the US are party to, and the parties for which meet every year at the COP summits to make decisions on the future of climate action. Withdrawing from that is going to hurt US credibility in future climate negotiations for the foreseeable future. You know, we were at COP this year, and even in the week after the election, it was incredibly difficult for other parties to take any commitments from the US seriously because they couldn't trust that the new administration was going to keep those commitments after the inauguration, and we're already seeing the impacts of that. And more broadly, even outside the climate ambit, if we can't keep agreements that we've made in the past, how can other countries trust our diplomatic relationships or any commitments in any field? When it comes to climate change specifically, we know that the world does not have years to delay in massively scaled up climate action. We see the effects of the climate crisis becoming visibly worse each day, and we are approaching or even reaching irreversible tipping points when it comes to climate change that we can't easily undo in 4 years, in 8 years, without immediate massive action in reducing emissions right now, and without adaptation to the effects we're already feeling. We saw this month in the US, the horror of the California wildfires that are affecting communities, that are affecting Americans, that are affecting migrants, that firefighters from Mexico are coming to support us in fighting. to prevent these disasters from becoming worse in the future, the world needs to drastically reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and also build out our adaptation frameworks. So, reducing brush, building more resilient housing, making sure power lines aren't at risk for starting fires. And the Paris Agreement provides the framework for the world to do all of those things through nationally determined contributions and through national adaptation plans. And because climate change doesn't have any regard for borders, the causes and consequences of it have to be addressed by every single country in the world. And without the US's leadership and involvement, we're going to be at risk of not meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So rather than withdrawing from them completely, especially as a country that has contributed the most historically to climate change and continues to contribute to, the US really must be a leader in these efforts. We're going to be making the effects of climate change worse on every community around the world that's already feeling the brunt of it. And displaced communities and refugees in particular are really chief among these communities. Some of the work we've done in the past few years at Refugees International has been to ensure that refugee voices are heard in the negotiating rooms at COPs. We've been really lucky to have refugee fellows attend the past couple of years, including Kiamuddin Ikram, who's our refugee fellow from Afghanistan, and Ayo Irene Helen, who's our refugee fellow living in Uganda from South Sudan, and to bring the voices of their communities to these experts. But if the US withdraws and is not sending a delegation, then who's there to listen to them? And I say all of this that it's important to hear from these communities because, as much as we're feeling the effects here in the US of floods, of heat waves, of extreme storms in communities that aren't used to dealing with them, imagine being in a refugee settlement in a community that doesn't necessarily have access to electricity, it doesn't necessarily have running water, and living through a heat wave of 120 degrees, or a massive rainstorm when you're living in a tent covered only with a tarp, or you planted your crops and the rains just didn't come this season or didn't come the month that you planted, but because you've been given land to farm, there's no food aid being given out in that refugee settlement anymore either. And this is all the reality of the refugee communities in Uganda that we've been working with this year, and the refugee-led organizations that are at the forefront of responding to these crises. But without the international architecture and without the national bilateral foreign development assistance that the US has contributed in the past, these organizations that are already doing so much with so little are left with even less to work with as the effects of climate change get worse and worse. So these global commitments via the Paris Agreement and other avenues are essential to support these communities and to prevent further displacement, whether it's of these communities or of others who are currently living in their homes but need support to adapt in place and to be able to prevent forcible displacement to either bigger cities in their own countries, to neighboring countries, or internationally. And so I bring up the freeze on foreign development assistance as well, because that's going to have a huge impact on displaced populations' ability to withstand the impacts of climate change. And the US has a long legacy of supporting other countries as they face typhoons, hurricanes, landslides, earthquakes, cyclones, tsunamis, you name it, and also of being supported by our neighbors, as I mentioned, with firefighters from Mexico coming to support the Los Angeles firefighters in the wildfires. So what we know is actually that responding after a disaster is incredibly inefficient. It's not the most cost-effective way of dealing with these things. And if we know that these disasters are coming and that they're getting worse, we can invest in resilience and adaptation and disaster preparedness now. And that actually saves 3 to 10 times as much on the back end in terms of responding to a disaster. It also saves a tremendous amount, obviously, in terms of human lives, livelihoods, and homes as well. But it really is an investment and an economically efficient way of addressing these crises, in addition to being the kind, compassionate thing to do in terms of both our communities here in the US and our neighbors. So one thing that we can do today is encourage the movement that began during the last Trump administration, which is called We Are Still In. And that was cities, states, local leaders, businesses, other private organizations making the commitment to meet the agreement of every piece of emissions reduction, adaptation, et cetera, support from the Paris Agreement, even though the US at the national level has withdrawn. So city leaders, private sector leaders attended COP summits. They made commitments to reduce their emissions to Paris Agreement levels, and they supported their communities in adapting to climate change. And at the individual level, you can also make climate smart decisions in terms of where you get your energy from, how you get around, and also to contact your local leaders to be part of the We Are Still In movement and to develop local adaptation plans to prevent displacement within your community and to really make sure that your neighbors who might be most at risk, whether that's immigrant communities or others, are included and meaningfully consulted as those adaptation plans are developed. So I'll leave you there with that. Thank you so much, Mohammed.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn, really for detangling for us why the Paris Agreement is so critical to combating climate change and climate-induced displacement, which will only increase in the years ahead. I'd like to take this personal opportunity to thank all of my esteemed colleagues across our portfolios of work for your interventions today. I know this came together rather quickly. It's been a very heavy week for all of us, and I'm just so grateful to be serving with you at our organization. I'd like to now move on to our audience Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I know that there's several that have already been answered, and we'll continue to follow up around those in the weeks ahead. Let me check. What do we have here? Okay. We've had several really great questions on parole, for example, on what it means to be an organization at this time, to be doing this work. One of the questions that has just come in, my concern is that President Trump doesn't seem to be influenced by facts or information. For example, in 2017, he commissioned a report from DHS regarding the cost-benefit analysis of resettlement. Trump rejected this report and demanded a new version that was only 3 pages long and considered only the costs of resettlement. How can we convince Trump to walk back some of these policies if facts don't seem to matter? Well, what a poignant question there. So, Yael, let me pass it over to you, and then maybe Jeremy would love for you to chime in on that as well.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things. I think part of what we need to present the facts as they are as best we can, because even if President Trump doesn't necessarily always appreciate them, I think members of Congress certainly do, local business people certainly do, your local officials might. And so this is a democracy. It's not, President Trump isn't like an emperor. We can work to advocate and use facts when we know they'll be valuable with other officials. Another thing that we're devoted to doing, and I think Kate really mentioned this, and I truly believe it because it's what I did when I was since I've been here, I was here during the first administration. We have to bear witness to what's happening. There is an important role of bearing witness to and bringing up the human stories and the human impact of really, really harmful policies. And I think what I was saying during my remarks about the military, what happened during the family separation crisis during the Trump administration, the kind of stories that Jeremy started with about what it means when refugee families are separated, when people are stranded in danger, those are stories that are meaningful and that can change hearts and minds too. I'll pass it to Jeremy.
Yeah, it's a really great question. In a way, it is sort of one of the major questions that I think groups like ours, advocacy organizations across the country, are grappling with. If you can't persuade the government with fact, how do you influence them? We actually went through a major strategic review process over the past year, dealing with exactly that sort of question, and grappling with how would we need to position ourselves as Refugees International this year if we found ourselves in the position we're now in. Facts are one tool that we have. Facts remain important for all the reasons that Yael said, and even if we have a White House that is somewhat immune to those facts when it comes to migration, and I know exactly the report that you're talking about. It was a great report. That still matters beyond the White House, but also we need to look to the public. We need to look to the states. This is where your voices as citizens and as voters are really, really important. Even if the Trump White House doesn't care about the cost benefit of bringing refugees into the country, I think they will care if local businesses and communities that have hired a lot of parolees and refugees start going under because they are losing all their workers. And so I think we need to find different pressure points. We need to find pressure points that are more about bottom up influence from voters, and not just about trying to kind of do insider expertise and factual persuasion here in DC.
Like Jeremy, I'd love to bring in Kate, especially on that last point around mobilizing business communities. Kate, thoughts?
No, I mean, I think, Jeremy, that last point you made is exactly what I was thinking is, facts to be interpreted as they will by the Trump administration, but it's pretty hard to deny the economic impact. And not only, I think, the economic impact on employers and the workforce impacts. And historically, businesses and employers have had arguably more sway with the Trump administration, perhaps, than other entities or other stakeholders. But I think beyond that, just the broad economic impact on the American public, if these deportations move forward, if we start detaining hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, there will be a concrete economic impact for all American families. And so if he was running on the platform that he was going to make our pocketbook stronger, there's going to be an impact pretty quickly if we start to lose folks and prices of everything go up. So I think that's the very sad reality. And I that's not what it should be, but I think that's something that we'll have to see how it plays out.
Another question has come in here. Maybe quickly, I'll pass it to you, Yael. What do we tell our refugee friends or clients or community members while the powers that be decide which pieces of these orders are constitutionally legal and enforceable? I know, in fact, we discussed this just this very morning because there is so much uncertainty and fear that is just traveling across impacted communities. Yael, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is the most important question because people really feel insecure. And that is part of the strategy of the Trump administration. Part of it is to breed fear so that the public doesn't just is scared to speak out when they see something wrong, that people will like self-deport, which is something that I've been doing a lot of work with the Mexican embassy and talking to them about what they're seeing and what the consulates are seeing. And that self-deportation is actually not happening. And that is good news. And that is because there are resources out there for people. We put some of them in the chat. And I think the problem is that I can't say for sure, right, that a single person is completely safe. But what I can tell the audience here is that there are ways to make yourself safe. There are things you can proactively do to be careful. And we also know the logistical constraints, some of which I talked about, related to this enforcement policy, the enforcement policy that the Trump administration has put out this week. There have been a handful of raids that have happened so far, but none of what was anticipated 2 weeks ago. So take that for what it's worth. Take it as a sign that a lot of what this is to raise fear, and try to really think carefully about what you can do to protect yourselves, and know that fighting that fear is part of actually the project of pushing back. And also not being afraid to speak to your neighbors about your fear and talk to them about what they can do, because I think part of what will what I really worry about in terms of local communities is that people will not talk about what they're afraid of and not share with their neighbors, like, this is what I'm afraid of. And it's that sharing that is going to get communities to push back. So I really think that this is the kind of conversation we need to have. Really reach out to the organizations that we put in the chat, like really take that seriously, because the more we talk about this, the more I think we can understand what's real and what's actually a way of pushing back against some of the fear mongering that's happened this week.
I know I've gotten dozens of calls this week personally. I know many of us across the screen have gotten dozens of calls from community members, and many of you have received phone calls. Um, Thank you so much. We'll end the Q&A portion here. There are a number of other questions. We'll try our best to answer them in just right after this webinar. But thank you for joining us today. We at Refugees International, since really 1979, we've spoken truth to power, regardless of who the president has been, or regardless of who served across our congressional halls. We are grateful for your time. We're grateful for your support. There's sort of three takeaways here that I'd love to just share before I pass over to Jeremy. Stay in touch by connecting us with, stay in touch by connecting with us across our social media accounts. That's where we share the latest of what's coming out from our organization and partner groups from across this country and across this world. Stay tuned for opportunities to take action in the weeks and in the months ahead. And please do consider donating to our organization's life-saving advocacy and work. It's been just such a privilege to be able to do this webinar with my colleagues. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jeremy, the President of Refugees International.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mohammed, and thanks to my colleagues, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in for this most particularly. It is really energizing for us to see the interest and the energy from you, and we so appreciate it. As Mohammed said, going forward, we would greatly appreciate your donations to our work, but frankly, as importantly, we want to see you take action, and we will be creating opportunities for that in the months ahead, just to sort of underscore the fluidity and the urgency and the challenges and the risks of what we are facing in this new period. As we have been sitting here, a new guidance from the State Department has leaked that will mandate a stop work order on all global humanitarian programs apart from food aid, in the context of all global assistance. So they are stop working all global foreign assistance that the U.S. is funding, exempting food aid, but not exempting the other about $10 billion a year of humanitarian assistance that the U.S. finances. So it is no exaggeration to say that is a fatal order that will cost lives. So this is what we're up against. This is why what we're doing is so important, and we so appreciate your support and your engagement. Thank you.